In the last video, we looked a little bit at more complex kinetic reactions. We discussed equilibrium. We discussed also the case of a steady state. And now we can probably move on to a little bit more advanced reactions, like they happen in biochemical pathways in truly very complex systems. And this is basically what happens in every cell. Here's just a little picture of one of these biochemical pathways. So I think this we are looking here at glycolysis. And we also know that all these reactions in the bodies are catalyzed by certain enzymes, and all these enzymes are actually integrated in these metabolic networks. But at the end of the day, even enzymes are governed and guided by the rules of kinetics. So what I want to do with this session here is I want to show you really how exciting and almost sometimes unpredictable things are. Even if they look totally innocent, it can cause us a little bit of a headache when we look at these reactions. We know that very often reactions are in sequential order. So we have a compound A, we have a compound B, and we have a compound C, and A is converted into B with a certain rate constant, and we can write this as a rate law. Very often we will find that the rate order here is first order, and in the following I'm just dealing with first order reactions. And we have seen that in previous videos. Sometimes we also have parallel reaction where the same compound is actually, like A here, is used in parallel reactions. So for example, you can imagine that, for example, glucose is used for different purposes, or a certain amino acid is used in different pathways, each with a pathway with a rate constant K1 or K2. So here it gets a little bit more tricky when we look at these parallel reactions. And there are loads and loads and loads of different reactions that are happening, and quite importantly, these reactions are also fine-tuned and fine-regulated. And it is not just that we have simply linear pathways, like here from aspartate to aspartyl phosphate to, so that would be simple amino acid biosynthesis. Some of these pathways are regulated in that they have feedback loops here. Very often a feedback loop, and in particular a negative feedback loop, is symbolized by this sign here. So the way you need to read that is that if you, for example, look at this picture here, you find that threonine, the amino acid threonine, inhibits the conversion from aspartate to aspartyl phosphate. Now this is quite interesting, because if you follow it, you see that aspartate is converted to this compound, is converted to this compound, is converted to this compound, to homoserine, and then is converted to threonine. So, and threonine then has a negative feedback loop, and it basically stops its own production by stopping this conversion from aspartate to aspartyl phosphate. And these feedback loops, these negative feedback loops, are an absolutely core component of biological pathways. Without these negative feedback loops, life as we know would not be possible. Now let's have a look a little bit more at these individual elements of biological pathways. And I encourage you to stop the video at certain points and ask yourself, what do I actually predict? What is going to happen? Now here we have a very simple biochemical pathway, and we have already discussed what happens in this case. So we produce A with a certain rate constant R. We then consume A with a rate constant S and produce B. B is then consumed with T. And we earlier said we can write the rate equation for the change in A with this rate equation, and we can do the same for B, dB over dt. We can use this equation. So what do we expect actually to happen? We also said we can predict what happens when we have a steady state. So here that would be steady state for A. And we can also predict what happens for B in a steady state. So that would be our concentration of B. That is our concentration for A. And we have a steady state. And we see that in the steady state, the concentration of A depends on these two rate constants. And again, the concentration of B depends on rate constants. And therefore, if the concentrations only depend on the rate constants, then A and B are constants. So the concentration of A and B are constant. So this could be, for example, a simple conversion reaction here from some kind of protochlorophyllite into another chlorophyll. Now, can we calculate the different intracellular concentrations? If we know R, S, and T, we should not have any problems, and we can use some modeling software. So modeling software to do the calculations for us. So here I use some that looks at time and the concentration of A and B. So A in this case is the red line, B is the blue line, and depending on the rate constants here, these are our rate constants. We find that the concentration of B and A are constant after a certain time. We need a little bit of time to establish the steady state and this steady state equilibrium. But once we've reached it, so for example here and here, from there on, these concentrations of A and B are pretty constant in the cell. So that's not terribly exciting, not shocking in a way. We can also express that in a slightly different way. So here we are looking at the concentration of B versus the concentration of A, and we have different starting points. Let me see if I can indicate that. Here, so for example, we start here with a fairly high concentration of A. Let me just quickly check. And it doesn't matter with which concentration of A and B we actually start, we will always end up here at one single point of the combination of A and B. So we end up with one single concentration pair of A and B. And this, of course, depends on our rate constants. So we can also say the system that we are dealing with, in this case, has one single solution. It converges to one discrete solution. And this solution is totally independent from the initial concentration of A and the initial concentration of B. It doesn't matter whether we have a high or a low concentration of A, a high or low concentration of B. We always end up with the same concentration, with the same steady state concentration of A and B. That's good. That's reassuring to know there's nothing terribly strange going on. Interestingly, what we see if we look at that is that we reach the steady state points here at different times. So we reach the steady state for A earlier than the steady state for B. And in a way, this is intuitively, it makes sense because A comes first in the biological pathway, and then B, so B is second, A is first, and that means it makes sense that we reach the steady state concentration for A before we reach the steady state concentration for B. And if we wait long enough, actually it doesn't matter when we reach it, because once we've reached it, we are always there with the steady state concentration. Great. Now this was quite easy. So if we know the kinetic parameters, it is quite easy to calculate the steady state concentrations of A and B. And we also saw that the steady state level is always the same. It converges always to the same solution, and it doesn't matter what our initial concentrations of A and B are. So far, so good. Now let's look at a slightly more complex pathway. This is a pathway that researchers thought they don't really exist in biological systems because they are quite interesting actually. But the more we looked, the more we found these pathways. This pathway actually contains a positive feedback loop. And that's quite interesting. So we produce A is consumed, so far so good. We produce B, and B then is consumed, but B actually exerts a positive effect on the production of A. So what is going to happen here? This could be, for example, the synthesis of a transcription factor which is required for its own transcription. So A would be the mRNA and B is the transcription factor concentration. Now, can we actually calculate the different intracellular concentrations? What happens with A and B? Try to predict what's happening. We can write our rate laws, and for B, nothing much happens in this case. This is actually exactly the same general rate law for B as we had in the previous example without the negative feedback. But for the change in A, there is all of a sudden a change in the equation. Okay, A is consumed by this part here, but the production here, this depends on the strength, how strong this feedback loop is, that is usually abbreviated with N, the concentration of the feedback or the contribution of the feedback, and at another factor at which concentration B has its half maximum contribution. And this is all put into this part of this equation, and that's getting a little bit hairy. Now let's try to predict what's happening here. What are the consequences of this rather innocently looking positive feedback loop? Here's just something to symbolize what these different parameters mean. So N indicates how strong this is, and H indicates here the half maximum contribution of B. So what is going to happen? Now here I've modeled again what's going to happen. So here we have the concentration of A. Here is the concentration of B. And I've chosen some parameters here for what we used to have. And what do we see is some really interesting things. In this case, it actually depends on the concentration, on the initial concentration, where the system will end. So if we have low A and low B, so A initial and B initial are both low, our A final and B final will also be low. They are indicated here by this first arrow here. A initial, B initial low, A final and B final are low. But what happens if A initial and B initial are high? Like here in this part here. We end up with a system that is high. So A final and B final are both high. This means, in this case, the system converges to two solutions. And these, whichever solution it is, it depends on AI and BI. It is almost like a switch that we have. If we have low concentrations of A and B at the start, the system will stay in a slow state. If we have high concentrations of A and B at the start, the system will converge to a high state. So here, the steady state, if we have a low initial concentration of A, we will end up with a low state. If we start with high concentrations of BI and AI, we end up with a high state. So depending on the initial concentrations, we end up with different end products. And that is something that baffled researchers for a long, long time. Basically, the system has two stable states. It's also called bistable or bistability. And which state is reached really depends on the initial concentrations of A and B. Now that's quite weird. Examples for bistability is, of course, as I mentioned before, the synthesis of a transcription factor. The lac operon in E. coli depends on bistability. If there is not a lot of lactose around in the environment, we don't express anything, says E. coli. If there is lots of lactose around in the environment, we have a high expression. So it is basically these positive feedback loops can act as switches, yes or no. Blood clotting or the autocatalysis of digestive enzymes are all guided by positive feedback loop. And most importantly, prion diseases like, say, Alzheimer's or mad cow disease are all regulated by these. Just had to stop the video because there was an important phone call coming. So where was I? Oh yes, with prion diseases like Alzheimer's or mad cow disease, we find that originally if there are no prions, there's low risk of prions. But if by any chance we get a higher initial concentration of the prion proteins in the misfolded state, then all of a sudden we will end up with a very high level of prion diseases, prions and misfolded proteins in the brain. Now, we said that positive feedback loops produce this bistability, but do all positive feedback loops actually introduce bistability? Well, the answer is no. It actually really depends on these parameters here that I described earlier. And they are quite sensitive. So if we choose, for example, some parameters, or if they are present in the cell, some parameters, then either with a low or a high state, so with even at low A initial and B initial, we end up with the high state only. So these parameters that are involved in the rate equation for the reaction for the general rate law of A, these parameters have a massive influence on how the biological system will react. So here we have low AI, higher AI, nothing happens. They converge all at the same state. So in a way, the system lost one of its steady states, one of the two. It is constantly switched on. Here is a very, very common pathway. It is a negative feedback pathway, and I showed you negative feedback pathways in the amino acid synthesis. So the concentration of B has a negative effect on the concentration of A. This could be a repression of gene expression, a typical repressor, or just negative feedback in the amino acid synthesis. And what happens is when we plot that versus time, we see usually these concentrations of A and B. So here we have A again, here we have B. The concentrations of A and B reach a steady state position. They wobble at the beginning, so up and down, but they reach a steady state eventually. And when we plot that in this kind of A versus B plot, so B versus A, we see it characteristic of a sort of an almost a spiral that we see here. This is this wobble thing, but it will converge towards one stable steady state. So this is what negative feedback loops do. They stabilize the system. Positive feedback loops introduce potentially bistability. They introduce a switch-like behavior of the system. Now this is getting complicated. Here we have two parallel pathways, and A is a negative inhibitor for B, while B is a negative inhibitor for A. Now that is interesting. So we can look at different parameters here again. So K1, K2, we can look at what happens with the onward reactions, and we are looking at how strong these inhibitions are, and we can express that here with our general rate equations. Now I want you to think about it. What could happen in this case? What would you expect? Protein A inhibits expression of protein B, and protein B inhibits expression of protein A. Can this system actually reach a stable steady state? What do you think? No, it does not. Here again, something really weird happens. We reach two stable steady states. Two stable steady states. But the picture looks different from the one that we had before. So again, we have bistability, but in a different form. One where we have B high, the concentration of B is high, and A is low. Or the concentration of A is high and B is low. So with these two negative feedback loops that influence each other, we again get bistability, but this time in a slightly different format. Weird, isn't it? We wouldn't have expected that, would we? Wow, now we have 1, 2, 3 negative feedback loops. So A inhibits B, B inhibits C, and C inhibits A again. Okay, what do you think will happen? Are we going to have one stable steady state or two bistability steady state? What do you reckon? Here we can express that again with our general rate law expressions. What do you think will happen? One or two stable steady states in this case? This is actually a typical genetic network where things inhibit each other. One stable steady state or bistability? The answer is neither. What we will find is actually an oscillation. Oscillation of the different compounds of A, B, and C. So while we get in general a sort of some stability in it, it's not totally random or chaotic. The different compounds show a very characteristic and typical time course where they go up and down. It is oscillation. And this is actually how a cell determines whether they should go into different parts of the cell cycle. So a protein that introduces the movement into, or the entry into, let's say, S phase, would be regulated through such an oscillation. And I think this is absolutely fascinating, because we would not have expected that just simply from three negative feedback loops that are somehow connected to each other. We are getting really complex behavior here, and this is actually called emergence. Emergence means that there are totally new and unexpected results from very simple starting points. And let's face it, this is not a terribly complicated system with three different negative feedback loops. But I bet you would not have expected something like an oscillation to happen in this case. And what we can do is, again, a typical phase plane diagram for oscillation. We end up with a sort of almost a stable system, but we don't end up in a discrete point. It just circles around this area, and it circles and circles and circles. And and it doesn't matter where we start from. It just simply circles around this stable state. It will never reach a defined state. It is just simply oscillating. So I think this is really exciting. We find that in the cell cycle, as I said, for example, the CDC kinases. We see this in opening and closing of a stomata, circadian rhythms in plants, accumulation of organic acids, and so on and so forth. So what have we learned? Well, we've learned that positive feedback loops can lead to bistability. Negative feedback loops can have stabilizing effects on a system. And negative feedback loops are really exciting because they convey stability to the system, whereas a positive feedback loop can, but it does not have to, introduce bistability. If we want to look at enzyme systems and what they can do, I think we just simply stop here at the moment, and we'll discuss that once you have done a little bit more on enzymes. So I hope this makes sense, and thank you very much for watching. This is a topic I'm really passionate about, because it is just, so unpredictable and so exciting.